Half of the bodies in our lab died of cancer, but not one of them died of a primary cancer, meaning they didn't die from where the cancer originally started, or that primary site of tumor formation. Instead, they died after the cancer spread from its original location to a new secondary site in the body. And that's actually true for most people who die from cancer. But there are a few primary cancers that don't need to spread in order to be deadly. And one of those is brain cancer. So today, with the help of the bodies in the lab, we're going to show you exactly why brain cancer can be so dangerous. We'll talk about how it's treated, what the survival rates look like, and why even benign, non-cancerous tumors in the brain can still be extremely serious. It's going to be a neoplastic one. So let's get into the pathological rudeness of brain cancer. So there are two major problems that are a little bit more unique to brain cancer compared to other cancers. The first and the more obvious one is that it's the brain. This is the command center. So cancer could lead to many different symptoms and problems. The second is we have a space issue. As we all know, the brain is housed within the skull. In other parts of the body, surrounding tissues can sometimes shift or accommodate a growing mass to a certain extent, but the skull is not going to expand or move aside. So the tumor is going to compress the brain as well as other tissues that are associated with the brain. And so let's take a look at how the brain actually sits within the skull, and this will help us to understand the different types of brain tumors and brain cancers. So here you're looking at the top left side of the head, and I'm going to start by removing the skin, which as you can see is kind of cool, and then you can see the skull. And when I remove the skull, you'll notice that we don't actually get down to the brain yet, because the brain is wrapped in these connective tissue membranes collectively known as the meninges. The first meningeal layer that you're seeing is this tough, thick connective tissue covering called the dura mater. Dura meaning tough, mater meaning mother, so tough mother. The tough part makes sense because this is a tough connective tissue, but the mother part, not so much. The anatomists of old thought the meninges gave rise to all the other tissues in the human body, so they thought of them as the mother tissues. They ended up being wrong, however, the name stuck, but let's be honest, we're kind of glad it stuck because it's just fun to say tough mother. But if I reflect the dura mater out of the way, you can see the next meningeal layer that has fallen onto the brain. This thinner, more transparent layer is referred to as the arachnoid mater. Arachnoid means spider-like because in certain areas of the brain, the arachnoid has these little extensions that look like little spider webs. Now, you may have noticed that I said the arachnoid had fallen onto the brain. And that's because in you, there would be fluid underneath the arachnoid pushing it up against the dura. And that fluid is called cerebrospinal fluid, or CSF. And so this means there's fluid in between the brain and the skull, which provides the brain with a hydraulic cushion. So when you're headbanging at a rock concert, your brain is not going to splat against the front or back of your skull. So one of the functions of the meninges is to create these spaces and passageways for CSF and even venous blood. The dura will also invaginate in certain regions, creating partitions or separating certain areas of the brain. For example, this structure here, called the falx cerebri, is an invagination of the dura that divides the cerebral hemispheres into right and left sides. But what was the point of going over all this information about the meninges? Well, besides that it's awesome and that learning any anatomy is probably the coolest thing you can ever do, this is relevant to brain cancer. For one, the brain tissue itself doesn't really detect pain, because how you detect pain is by telling the brain that something hurts. But the brain has nothing above it that it can report its pain to. However, the brain has surrounded itself with tissues and structures that do have pain receptors. Your meninges have pain receptors, so if they start getting tugged on or pushed on by tumors that are growing, this can create a pain signal and let you know that something could be wrong inside of your cranium. Also, you can actually have tumors that originate in the meninges, and these are called meningiomas. Meningiomas arise from the cells of the arachnoid layer, but they typically will also attach to the dura and grow inward. Now, even though meningiomas are grouped as a type of brain tumor, it's worth noting that they do not arise from the brain tissue itself. They originate from the tissues that are surrounding the brain. However, they are the most common intracranial tumors, and because of their proximity to the brain and the space issue that we've already discussed, they can have some similar effects because they can compress the brain. Now, most of the meningiomas are benign tumors, and so this is a good time to quickly clarify terms. A tumor is a broad term for an abnormal growth of cells. Tumors can be benign or malignant. In general, benign is better because these tumors are often encapsulated and less aggressive with invading surrounding tissues, so they're less likely to spread to another area of the body. Malignant tumors are much more aggressive. They tend to invade and be much more destructive to surrounding tissues, and so therefore they're more likely to metastasize or spread to a new location. And so malignant tumors are considered cancerous. So when people are getting their tumors biopsied, one of the things they're trying to figure out is if the tumor is benign or malignant. And again, people want to hear that their tumor is benign. However, in the case of the brain, benign tumors can still cause major problems because of that space issue. The skull is not going to expand, so even a benign tumor in the meninges can compress the brain tissue and cause some serious complications. Now, I'm assuming that most of you watching this video are interested in your health. So let me quickly talk about an awesome tool that can give you many incredible health insights, and that is the Hume Health Body Pod. One of the mistakes people can make when tracking their health is relying on a single number, like just your body weight. Now, your weight might go down, but that doesn't necessarily mean you're losing fat. In some cases, you could actually be losing muscle or even water. Like, I've actually lost over 5 pounds during some of my weekend long runs, and so I've used the Body Pod to also monitor my hydration status. The Hume Health Body Pod is able to do this because it is a clinical grade body analyzer and not just a bathroom scale. It uses bioelectrical impedance analysis to break down body fat percentage, skeletal muscle mass, hydration levels, and so much more. But what is even more useful is that it shows how fat and muscle is distributed throughout your body. It can show you subcutaneous fat versus visceral fat, how the fat is distributed in your limbs, and it can also show the distribution of your muscle in your trunk versus your limbs, and even between right and left sides. And this is extremely useful feedback because tracking these numbers over time helps you to know if what you're doing is working, or if you need to make adjustments to your workout and diet. The Body Pod is about 98% as accurate as a DEXA scan, and when I first started using it, I was able to compare it to lab-based body composition tests that I did around the same time, and the results were nearly identical. So I've been using it for months now, logging consistent weigh-ins and tracking everything in the app. And as a bonus, the Body Pod is HSA and FSA eligible. So if you want to know more about your own body composition beyond just your weight, click the link in the description and use our code THEANATOMYLAB, which will be active for the next 7 days so that you can get 20% off. Plus, that 20% discount also stacks on top of the current online sale for up to 50% off. And now, let's get back to brain cancer. So what about the tumors that originate within the actual brain tissue? Well, to help us understand this, it is helpful to understand what the brain is actually made of. If we were to zoom in and zoom into the brain tissue, we would see that the brain is pretty much made up of 2 cell types, or 2 different categories of cells: neurons and neuroglial cells, sometimes just called glial cells. Neurons are the ones that we hear the most about, and there's anywhere from 80 to 90 billion neurons that make up your brain. And neurons are the cells that send electrical signals and form communications with each other that we refer to as synapses. And just so we can all take a second to be impressed with the human brain, each neuron can form thousands of synaptic connections, meaning that you can have over 100 trillion synapses, which is absolutely remarkable. However, the neuroglial cells are also very impressive and very important to the structure and function of the brain. There are roughly a similar number of neuroglial cells as neurons, which still means tens of billions of these support cells. Glial actually means glue, and so the early anatomists kind of thought of these cells as the cells that held the brain together. And they do provide structure and support for the neurons, but they also help supply energy to neurons and maintain energy balance. They help form the blood-brain barrier, provide immune function, and even insulate neurons in order to speed up electrical signals. But here's another important distinction between neurons and neuroglial cells. Neurons generally do not divide, or in other words, they do not undergo cell division. However, neuroglial cells divide all the time. And you might initially wonder, why is that important? Well, tumors form from cells dividing out of control. Cells that don't normally divide, like neurons or mature cardiac and skeletal muscle fibers, don't typically form tumors. You rarely hear about tumors made primarily from neurons or cardiac and skeletal muscle fibers, because again, those cells don't naturally divide for the most part. So what I'm getting at here is that because the neuroglial cells naturally divide, they are much more likely to divide out of control if they accumulate certain mutations in their DNA. And once these neuroglial cells start dividing out of control, they can form one of the most aggressive and deadly primary brain tumors called the glioblastoma. As that name implies, a glioblastoma is a type of tumor that arises from the neuroglial or glial cells, most commonly from a specific type of glial cell called astrocytes. And it behaves very differently than something like a meningioma. Because remember, meningiomas tend to grow on the outside of the brain and compress inward. Glioblastomas grow from within the actual brain tissue itself. And instead of forming a nice, well-defined mass, they tend to infiltrate. These are not typically benign tumors like meningiomas. Glioblastomas spread into surrounding brain tissue almost like roots growing through soil. So instead of having a clear boundary, like with benign meningiomas, where you can say, this is tumor and this is normal brain, those lines become very blurred with glioblastomas. And that creates a major problem when it comes to treatment. When treating brain tumors, the approach really depends on things like where the tumor is located, how large it is, how fast it is growing, whether it's benign or malignant, and whether surgeons can even safely access it without causing too much damage to surrounding brain tissue. But surgery is one of the most common treatment options. The goal with surgery is usually to remove as much of the tumor as possible. And in some cases, especially with tumors like mini meningiomas that are more well-defined and grow by compressing from the outside, surgeons may be able to remove a very large portion of the tumor and sometimes even all of it. But tumors like glioblastomas are much more difficult to deal with surgically because, again, they do not just push on the brain from the outside, they grow from within the brain tissue itself and infiltrate into surrounding areas. So even if a surgeon removes everything that appears to be tumor to the naked eye or on imaging, there can still be microscopic tumor cells left behind in the surrounding brain. And that is one of the major reasons why glioblastomas are so challenging. So then we're left hoping the other treatment options can be successful, such as radiation therapy, which uses high energy radiation to damage tumor cells, and chemotherapy, which uses medication to try to slow or stop tumor growth. And often these treatments are used together. But beyond that, we still have that same issue we've been talking about throughout this whole video: space. As the tumor grows and infiltrates, it also creates pressure within the skull. And that pressure can compress nearby brain structures, disrupt blood flow, and interfere with normal brain function, which is why individuals with brain tumors can develop symptoms like headaches, seizures, changes in cognition, weakness, or even changes in personality, depending on where the tumor is located. And so this creates the need for other treatments for managing all these other potential symptoms. Now for glioblastomas, the outcomes or the prognosis is unfortunately very poor. Even with aggressive treatment, median survival is about 15 months, and long-term survival is uncommon. That does not mean treatment is pointless, because treatment can prolong life, reduce symptoms, and improve quality of life. But it does mean that glioblastomas remain one of the most devastating primary brain cancers. Benign meningiomas have a much better prognosis. In many cases, especially when they can be surgically removed, 5-year survival rates are over 90%. However, even with these tumors, outcomes still depend heavily on size and location, because a tumor pressing on critical areas of the brain can still lead to significant symptoms and complications. So while the term brain cancer often makes us think about how aggressive a tumor is, what makes tumors in the brain so unique is not just what they are, but where they are. Because in most parts of the body, there is still at least some room to adapt. But inside the skull, we have very little room for error. So thank you for watching and supporting the channel, everyone. Hopefully you learned some useful information today, and we'll see you in the next video.